talk some directional terms related to the body. So these can be difficult if you're new to this, but we're going to try to break this down into the simplest format. One of the easiest ways to learn this is really just to create some flashcards. There's a lot of memorization that just goes into these particular terms, and then as you memorize the meanings, you can go ahead and do more practical applications, start to read some notes, start to put them in your notes. But go ahead and just really put these on some flashcards or whatever your favorite way to memorize these is, because that is really the first step to being confident with this. Okay, so we've got our patient here. He is in what we call anatomical position. So when we talk about all of our directional terms, we are really talking about the patient from anatomical position, not particularly the position they might actually be in front of you. So we really are comparing from the perfect setting. So we've got our patient standing. Feet are going to be forward, which should be obvious, right? The face forward. This is why we do all of our diagrams facing a patient, because this is anatomical position. So all of our diagrams and all of the texts or other things you might read on the internet are going to be in anatomical position. The one thing that is maybe a little bit tougher is that the arms are going to be down by the sides and the palms are facing forward. So making sure that as you're doing some of the activities, games, answering questions, that those palms are facing forward, because naturally they tend to face in if you're just kind of hanging the arms down by the side, and that might make your answers a little bit off. So they are palms forward for the anatomical position. All right, so again, this is the reference point for all of the things we discuss in medical terminology and inside of anatomy. Okay, so I have some outlines. I know I took out their center color, and you're seeing a side view and a front view here. And each term we're going to talk about, we're going to look at how they get placed onto each one of these views. So we're going to start adding some terms, and again, write these down, pause the video, create a flashcard, use your word lists as you need to make sure that you're memorizing this component. It really is very foundational to everything you're going to do for your future career. Okay, this picture on the left is often sometimes referred to as a lateral view because we're coming in from this side. Okay, and this picture on the right is often referred to as a frontal view, right? We're looking at them from the front. Okay, let's start with the term anterior. So if you want to reference back to our body cavities, we refer to the three, the thoracic, the abdominal, and the pelvic, as the anterior cavities. And so anterior really means the front of you, okay? So anterior refers to our front side. And in fact, anterior, if you look at the word list, means to be towards the front. I did put a word here in parentheses. And so this is another alternative word that you can use. Anterior is definitely the most common that is referenced amongst healthcare providers, but oftentimes the word ventral is used, ventral, and ventral also means the same thing, towards the front. And ventral really is a little bit different. Ventral does often refer to the belly side. Now, as humans, we walk on 2 feet. So our front side and our belly side happen to be the same thing. And because we're talking about human anatomy, human medical terminology, anterior and ventral can be used interchangeably. Now, if you're doing veterinary medicine, right, the front side would be, say, the dog's face or the front portion, and their belly would point more towards the ground, and that would be their ventral portion versus the face, which would be the anterior. But for human anatomy, anterior and ventral both face forward, even though ventral does mean the belly side. Okay, the next piece also has 2 terms. All right, so posterior, okay, is the term that means to be towards your backside. Okay, so posterior means to be behind you or back. There is a word in parentheses as well, the dorsal, D-O-R-S-A-L, and we saw those with that body cavity videos as well. The cranial cavity and the spinal cavities were both facing towards your back, which is why we refer to them as your dorsal cavities. Posterior really does mean behind, right? Whereas dorsal means to be almost like the buttocks region. So again, if we're talking about a dog, this might be different, but for humans, posterior and dorsal can be used fairly interchangeably. So if you see one versus the other, that's really just provider preference. Okay, this next term has overlapped both of these. Um, and so we're looking at the term superior. So supero as a root term refers to being on top of. And so superior means to be on top, above, okay, over. And so the superior side of you is on the top portion of you. It does in fact have an opposite. So while anterior means the front and its opposite is posterior, which is the back, superior means the top and inferior means to be lower or towards the bottom. It does not mean that superior has to be all the way at the head and that inferior means to has to be all the way at the bottom. I just put that there to demonstrate where they belong. But inferior means to be below, under, or lower than something else when we're describing two objects. Okay, next up is not really a directional term, but it is something you have to understand the next few terms, and that is the midline. So the midline is on this frontal view, or this right-hand picture that I've got here, and it really is just the center or the dead center portion of you, because the next two terms we're going to talk about refer to this midline, and so you have to know what that is to really understand those terms. So first up, we have the term medial. I know I've put this kind of on the legs here, and this could be the legs or the arms. However, the term medial is only applied to a limb. So from shoulder down to fingertips and hips down to toes. If we're referring to the main portion of the body, you're going to use some of these other terms that we've talked about and not medial or the word we're going to look at next. But medial is defined as being towards the midline or towards the inside. And you can see I've kind of put it in towards the inside portion of the thighs. Okay, and that is because it is closer to the midline than the next word we're going to look at. So that medial is to be closer towards the midline. All right, its opposite is going to be lateral. Lateral refers to the side. Okay, and it would be defined probably best by saying further away from the midline. So while the inside of the thighs is going to be the medial portion, the outside of the thighs are further away from that midsection, right? And so that is referred to as the lateral portion. It's the same for the arms, right? If we were to point to the inside of the elbow, you would refer to that as the medial portion. And if you point to the outside of the elbow, that is the lateral portion of the elbow. What happens if you point to the front of the knee? What would we call that? Because we did learn a term that referred to front. Okay, that would actually be the anterior portion of the knee, right? When we say the medial, it really refers to the parts that are sticking towards the inside. And if we're pointing towards the very back of the knee, that would be the posterior portion. So there's really four sections around a joint that we can label, right? The anterior would point forward, the posterior points back. The medial is towards the inside, and the lateral is towards the outside. Okay, our next two terms also come in a pair because they are opposites. While I am placing them at the shoulders and I'm putting them on the arms, they can again be used for either the arms or the legs. So either the shoulder to the fingertips or the hips to the toes. These will never be used for the midsection of you, just so you're aware, because the definition of the first term we're going to look at, proximal, so Proximal, means to be closer to the point of attachment. So we're taught, or closer to the trunk of the body. So the point of attachment is the trunk of the body, right? So we're never going to use anything in the thorax or the abdomen and use that word proximal. So only for arms, only for legs. But if you're talking about the shoulder, or if you're looking at the legs, the hip, they attach right to the trunk, right? So that is the most proximal portion of the limb, or the closest to the point of attachment, right, to the main center of the body. So proximal means to be closest to attachment, or nearest to attachment, or closest to the trunk. On the flip side, again, only used for the limbs, would be the term distal. And it refers to being further away, right? Think distant. Distal is very similar to be further away. So let's take an example of the upper body. The shoulder would be proximal, and the wrist would be distal. The hip would be proximal. The toes would be distal, right? One is closer to that center point of attachment, and one is much further away. Okay, next we're going to look at a pair, and they do mean opposites again. One is superficial. And superficial, if you're going to take an exact definition, means close to the surface of the skin. So a superficial cut means you have literally just scraped the surface of your skin, generally not that serious. Whereas something that is deep is going to go through many layers and head much further towards the inside of the body. So deep refers to being further into the body. So a superficial cut, not likely to be serious, but a deep cut, you might need to go get some sutures. And so if you're describing a cut, right, you might want to describe that it is a very deep cut, right, to the right wrist, okay, and therefore is going to require sutures. If it's very superficial, it may just require a bandage and some cleaning. All right, here's your finalized picture, okay, of what all of those terms are. So make sure that you start to memorize those terms, because as you start to create your notes and other activities, you have to understand those basic definitions in order to create great notes.